Early afternoon, June 4th, 1942. Japanese dive bombers from the carrier Hiryu hit an American carrier, leave her burning, and fly home to report her finished. A few hours later, a second wave launches from that same Hiryu and finds an American carrier dead ahead, undamaged, operating aircraft, a fresh target. They attack it too. It's the same ship. Twice in one afternoon, Imperial Japanese pilots believed they had found and destroyed two different American carriers. There was only ever one. And 3 weeks before that, an entirely different Japanese strike force had already reported this same ship sunk at the bottom of the Coral Sea. This is the story of the USS Yorktown, the carrier the Japanese Navy killed on paper 3 times, repaired by American shipyard workers in 3 days flat, and the ship that fooled an empire long enough to help sink 4 of its aircraft carriers in a single morning. At 2 in the morning on May 28th, sparks from dozens of welding torches lit up a Pearl Harbor dry dock like lightning. Nobody working that night was trying to make the Yorktown perfect. They were trying to make her float. To understand why, you have to go back 1 day earlier. The Yorktown limped into port on May 27th. A 500-pound bomb had punched 50 feet into her hull and exploded above the engine room. Her radar was gone. An elevator was wrecked. Her seams had sprung along nearly 30 frames. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who'd been aboard her at Coral Sea, looked at the damage and gave his honest opinion. 90 days in dry dock, minimum. Admiral Chester Nimitz didn't have 90 days. He had a basement. In a windowless room under his headquarters, a team of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had spent weeks quietly cracking pieces of the Japanese naval code. They were now confident of something almost nobody else believed. The same carrier force that had hit Pearl Harbor was now sailing for a speck of coral called Midway Atoll. Attack date, June 4th. 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, were healthy and ready. The third one Nimitz needed was currently sitting in a flooded dry dock with water pooling around her hull. He went down to see her anyway. Waders on, standing in the same water his engineers were standing in, Nimitz studied the wreckage for a long moment. Then he said the sentence that decided the battle before a single shot was fired. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." Nobody answered. Then the hull repair officer, Lieutenant Commander Finkstag, said the only thing you can say to an admiral standing in a flooded dry dock: "Yes, sir." Within minutes, 1,400 tradesmen descended on a single hull. Welders, electricians, pipe fitters, working around the clock in shifts that never really ended. The power draw was so enormous that civilian Honolulu had to accept rolling blackouts just to keep the lights on inside the dry dock. There was no time to do it properly. Cracked seams that should have been repaired individually got covered instead with one massive steel plate, welded over the whole damaged section. Compartments that normally took weeks to rebuild were patched, braced, and left half-finished, because half-finished and floating beat perfect and still in dock. One electrician who lived through it, Lewis Walters, remembered it simply. 16-hour shifts around the clock, nobody leaving the yard until the job was done. Men slept wherever they found space among the machinery. Civilian families brought food to share. When a new flight surgeon named Joseph Pollard came aboard fresh off orders from Pensacola, the ship was still in the middle of all of it. He'd later describe a flight deck still wearing temporary steel plates, combat integrity reduced by official estimate by about a third.
The ship, he said, was a beehive of activity the moment he stepped on board.
On May 30th, one day ahead of even the impossible deadline, the Yorktown eased out of Pearl Harbor under her own power. Repair crews were still working on her as she left, riding tugboats alongside, throwing scaffolding overboard as she picked up speed, jumping off when there was nothing left to fix. She wasn't whole. She wasn't even close. But 4,000 miles away, Admiral Yamamoto didn't know any of that. As far as Japanese intelligence was concerned, this ship had been sitting on the bottom of the Coral Sea for 3 weeks. A propeller cut through a cockpit canopy before the Japanese ever showed up. A brand new air group had just come aboard, pilots who'd never landed on this specific carrier before, and they needed practice, fast. During one exercise, a lieutenant commander brought his plane in and missed the arresting cable. As he taxied forward, a fighter behind him landed directly on top of his aircraft. The fighter's prop sliced clean through the canopy underneath it and very nearly took the man's head off where he sat. The enemy hadn't even appeared yet, and the Yorktown had already almost lost a pilot to her own flight deck. It was the only accident on the way out, but it was a warning, before a single Japanese plane was sighted, of how unforgiving this ship could be. There was a second incident nobody thought much about at the time. On June 4th, while crews laid out equipment for battle, someone noticed a leaking water tank and patched it, almost as an afterthought. Nobody knew yet how badly they were going to need that water. By June 1st, the preparations had turned serious. Anti-flash clothing, gas masks, helmets, stretchers staged at stations across the ship, battle dressing stations checking their supplies for the third, fourth time. Years later, someone asked the ship's physician what the mood was like in those final days. His answer surprised the interviewer. The morale on the ship was the best I've ever seen. Of course, everybody was fearful, as you normally would be going into battle. But you couldn't imagine a higher morale than there was aboard ship. Fear and confidence, sitting side by side. That was the Yorktown, 3 days out from the battle that would decide the Pacific War. A scrap of paper landed on the flight deck, and it changed everything. A scout plane that had launched before dawn returned mid-morning and dropped the note. The Japanese fleet had been spotted, roughly 200 miles out, closing at 25 knots. 200 miles was too far for the Yorktown's own planes to fly out, fight, and make it back. So for now, they waited. Down in the hangar deck, sailors went on arming aircraft. In battle dressing station number 1, the assistant medical officer checked his litters and supplies for what felt like the 100th time. Several decks below all of it, a young repair gang petty officer named Dwight DeHaven, a Montana farm boy who joined the Navy at 18 rather than spend his life milking cows twice a day, checked the steam lines he was responsible for and waited for word from above. That word would never really reach him. Topside, men could watch the battle build in real time, distant specks resolving into aircraft, the Enterprise and Hornet launching strikes against a target neither ship could see. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, the Yorktown's own strike came home, shot to pieces. Bombers so damaged, the deck crew wondered how they'd stayed in the air at all. One fighter, low on fuel, came in too hot, too high, and dove into the deck, somersaulting and landing upside down with the pilot trapped underneath. Pollard was the first man under the wreck. The pilot crawled out on his own power, unhurt. There was no time to feel relieved about it, because as that pilot was being walked back across the deck, general quarters sounded again. This time, it wasn't a drill. A black flak puff bloomed directly overhead, and Joseph Pollard finally understood the enemy wasn't 200 miles away anymore. They were directly above the ship.
He'd remember looking up and seeing dogfights in real time, a plane spiraling down, trailing fire, anti-aircraft guns beside him firing without pause. A chief pharmacist's mate grabbed his arm. "You and I better take cover." They dropped flat onto the steel deck, and Pollard, in the strange, irrelevant way the mind works under fire, found himself calculating exactly how to position his own arm so the deck wouldn't break it if it bucked beneath him.
Then the first bomb hit. It was a delayed action bomb, and it did the worst kind of damage a single bomb can do, punching down through the island structure, through the wardroom, into the engineering spaces below, blowing out the boiler fires that powered the entire ship. In an instant, the Yorktown went dead in the water. The lights went out. A second bomb struck the flight deck directly outside Pollard's station, tearing through two anti-aircraft gun mounts manned by roughly 40 sailors. 20 were killed instantly. The rest came to him, faster than his station had room for. Stretchers filled the dressing station floor, then the parachute loft behind it, then the passageway beyond that. A third bomb landed in the water near the stern, close enough that fragments swept a catwalk crowded with men who'd taken cover there. When Pollard finally made it onto the flight deck near the wrecked gun mounts, he found one of the gunners exactly where he'd been seated, the kind of sight that doesn't leave a man, even decades later. He didn't dwell on it. There wasn't time. 2 decks down and several compartments aft, Dwight DeHaven felt none of this as sight. He felt it as motion, the ship lifting under him, the lights dying, the battle lantern he'd hung up swinging loose and shattering on the deck, plunging his compartment into total darkness. For a moment, alone in the black with dead machinery around him, he thought the ship had been torpedoed. It was an experience that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He never went anywhere again, on any ship, without a flashlight within reach. Above them both, the Yorktown sat dead in the water, pouring black smoke from her stack. Visible, Pollard thought grimly, for miles in every direction. Everyone topside understood what that meant. Japanese submarines were known to be working the area, and a ship that couldn't move, broadcasting its position in smoke, was as close to a sitting target as a warship gets. Then, from somewhere below, the chief engineer found a way to relight the fires. White steam, not black smoke, began pouring from the stack. The ship that had been dead in the water began impossibly to move again. Men who'd spent the last 20 minutes bracing for the worst found themselves cheering instead. Aboard the Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier still untouched, pilots were landing and reporting success. An American carrier, hit, burning, finished. It wasn't finished. It was the Yorktown, moving again under a head of white steam, and the strike that had just attacked her had no idea they'd left her alive. With the ship moving, Pollard's team caught one piece of luck that would matter later. The senior medical officer, passing through the dressing station, used his authority to get the forward elevator lowered so the worst stretcher cases could reach the hangar deck before whatever came next. It turned out to be the difference between life and death for several of them. The Yorktown climbed toward the 30 knots she needed for flight operations. 22, then higher, when general quarters sounded again. This time, it was a second strike off the Hiryu, and by every account afterward, those pilots believed they were looking at a different ship entirely, a second, undamaged American carrier, freshly discovered. They radioed it in as a new target. It was the same ship they'd just claimed to have sunk. On the signal bridge, the same sailor who'd filmed the first attack watched a fresh white wake cut through the water directly toward the ship and kept the camera rolling. Below, DeHaven and the men around him braced. Two torpedoes struck the port side almost simultaneously, just below the waterline. The catwalk holding one of the anti-aircraft batteries folded backward on itself. The deck came up under Pollard like a blow to the ribs. And then the Yorktown began to list. It didn't stop. Pollard would estimate the angle at nearly 30 degrees. The official report later put it at 26. Either number meant the same thing. A flight deck steep enough that one wrong step would send a man sliding the full width of the ship and straight into the ocean. Then the order came over the speaker. Prepare to abandon ship. A wounded man on a stretcher near Pollard, his foot blown off, heard the announcement at the same moment Pollard did. He looked up. What does this mean for us? Then he turned his head away, already certain of the answer. Pollard didn't have one to give him. Men started taking their shoes off in the middle of a sinking ship. What followed wasn't panic. It was something stranger. Sailors all over the listing flight deck began removing their shoes, tucking watches and cigarettes and lighters inside them, lining them up neatly on the deck, as if they expected to be back within the hour to collect them. One chief started to do the same before DeHaven stopped him. You're going to need those shoes. The chief put them back on. Hours later, the two of them were reportedly among the only survivors pulled from the water still wearing footwear. Stretcher cases that couldn't climb were lowered over the high side on ropes down to the life rafts, possible at all only because of the elevator trick earlier. A young officer, Lieutenant Wilson, worked the lines with Pollard, getting the last of the wounded off.
Going down wasn't gentle. There were no knots tied into the ropes, so men lowered themselves hand over hand on raw grip alone. Pollard's hands were cut to the skin by the time he reached the armor belt and had to stop and rest. Around him, the descent was just as brutal for others. One man caught his heel on that same armor belt, snapped his leg, and finished the climb down in agony, in full view of the men waiting their turn. Once in the water, the danger just changed shape. The sea was calm, a small mercy, but coated in a thick slick of leaking bunker oil. It burned the eyes, filled the nose, and there was no way to avoid swallowing it. Survivors spent their time holding a line with one hand and vomiting black oil with the other.
Pollard wasn't done yet. Before going over the side himself, he went back through the island structure and along the catwalks one more time, searching for anyone left behind. He found no one. By the time he made it back to the edge of the ship, most of the crew had already gone over. He stood there alone for a moment, looking down at hundreds of heads bobbing in oil-slicked water, telling himself it was time to go. That's when he saw a single figure walking toward him across the empty, tilted deck. It was Captain Elliot Buckmaster. Navy regulations state that the commanding officer shall be the last to leave the ship, Buckmaster said, and I'm ready to go. Aye, aye, sir, Pollard answered. He told the captain he'd just checked the aft catwalk and confirmed no one was left alive back there. That was the last either man said. They went down the ropes side by side, into the water, into the oil, into whatever came next. Pollard spent 2.5 hours in the ocean, with no room left for him on any raft. He wasn't alone out there. Not far away, Buckmaster, the captain who had just been the literal last man off his ship, was in the water too. And when a passing whaleboat from the destroyer Russell came in too fast and threw a non-swimming mess attendant into the water, it was Buckmaster who swam over to hold the man up until help arrived. Eventually, the destroyer Hughes came alongside, and several men swam out to grab her cargo nets. Then, a submarine alert sent her to full speed ahead, dangerous for anyone near her hull, since a ship's propellers at speed can pull a swimmer under. Pollard waited it out. When the Hammond finally came past and the area seemed quiet, he made his decision. There was no point staying in the water to drown when there was a ship to swim for. He caught her cargo net and held on with a grip nobody could have pried loose without taking his arm with it. Hands reached down. He climbed aboard. He was safe. The story should end there. It doesn't, because the Yorktown, against every expectation, was still floating. 26 degrees of list, dead in the water, abandoned by her entire crew, and still afloat. Once aboard a rescue ship, Captain Buckmaster went to Admiral Fletcher with a request that must have sounded almost unreasonable: permission to put a salvage party back aboard his own ship and try to save her. Fletcher granted it. Among the volunteers was the same sailor who'd filmed the battle from the signal bridge, a signalman personally pulled out of a crowd of officers by Buckmaster himself. "Roy, you come with me." The salvage crew transferred to the destroyer Hammond, which tied up alongside the listing carrier to provide power and pumps, while engineers worked to relight her boilers. For a while, it looked like it might actually work. Spirits were optimistic. This broken 27,000-ton ship, one that two separate Japanese strike forces believed they'd already killed, might yet make it home.
Roy was crossing a small catwalk on the Yorktown's high side when the world came apart again. A Japanese submarine, the I-168, had found them. She put a spread of torpedoes into the Hammond, tied up directly alongside, and the destroyer broke in two almost instantly, sinking in minutes. As she went down, her own depth charges, 18 of them, still armed, detonated underwater, and the shock wave hit the Yorktown like a fist, shaking the carrier stem to stern and blowing men on deck off their feet and into the water. One of the torpedoes meant for the Hammond struck the Yorktown directly as well. The ship that had survived dive bombers, torpedo planes, and 2.5 hours of men assuming she was finished, finally, the next morning, rolled over and went under. She took with her the rescue ship that had tried to save her. For the survivors, the aftermath was its own kind of chaos. Destroyers and cruisers found themselves crammed with hundreds of rescued men. The cruiser Portland alone reportedly carried more than 1,000 at once, most of them barefoot, sunburned, exhausted. That night, aboard one of the rescue ships, a sudden explosion and a false submarine contact sent a fresh wave of panic through men who'd already survived one sinking in the last 24 hours. It turned out to be nothing. It didn't feel like nothing at the time. Pollard made it to the Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor not long after, walking the wards to check on the men who'd come through his dressing station. Near the foot of one bed, he found a familiar face grinning up at him, the same sailor who'd lost his foot on the flight deck and asked, in the worst moment of his life, what it all meant for him. Pollard had had no answer for him then. He didn't need one now. He just grinned back. Here's the number that actually decided the Pacific War, and it has nothing to do with the Yorktown herself. At Midway, the United States lost one carrier. Imperial Japan lost 4: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with hundreds of their most experienced naval aviators, men who'd trained for years and couldn't be replaced quickly, if at all. American industry, meanwhile, was just beginning to produce a new generation of carriers, faster and tougher than anything that fought at Midway. Japan's shipyards could not say the same. The Yorktown
didn't survive the battle that decided the war. She didn't need to. She'd already done the only thing that mattered. She made the Imperial Japanese Navy underestimate her, again and again, at exactly the moments that counted. Sunk in Japanese intelligence reports in early May. Attacked and presumed finished in the opening hours of June 4th. Attacked again hours later by pilots who thought they'd found a different ship entirely.
3 confirmed kills on paper. 1 ship. 0 of them real, until the very last one. It took a 500-pound bomb, 2 torpedoes, 1,400 shipyard workers, 3 sleepless days, 2.5 hours in the water, a salvage crew, a submarine, and a destroyer broken in half before Imperial Japan's assessment of the Yorktown finally caught up to reality. By then, it was already too late to matter. The battle was over. The war in the Pacific had already turned.